Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has completed his visit to Russia. Of course, you would have seen the big bear hug pictures that would have come out. It was nearly about, literally spent a full 1 day, including the night, in Russia. And to understand the importance of this visit and what are the ramifications, not just for India internally or bilaterally, but also on a global stage, I have with me two fine guests. I have with me Ambassador Pankaj Saran, who has been the former ambassador to Russia and he's also been India's deputy NSA. And right now, he is the convener of an independent think tank called the NatStrat. I have also with me the print columnist and associate fellow at the IDSA, Miss Swasti Rao. Welcome to the print, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, my first question to you, Ambassador. Narendra Modi has completed his visit. This was his first bilateral visit that he's undertaken after in his third term. Usually, he always goes to the neighboring countries. Why Russia?
Well, I mean, there is no fixed formula about which country he visits first. It's all a function of time and space. And remember, you hadn't had the summit for the last 2 years. So obviously, this was a long pending uh, visit or a meeting. So it was basically catching up with what was missed out in the last 2 years. But nevertheless, it is significant that he has chosen this time to make this bilateral visit. So I think it's very interesting. And it basically shows to me the importance that Russia occupies in Indian foreign policy, which it has always done. I mean, it's something which is very old.
Well, that is true. And Swasti, you are someone who tracks the Europe for us very closely. Modi's visit comes at a time when you have a meeting that is happening in the US of the NATO uh, member countries. How would you see this visit by by Prime Minister Modi at this particular juncture?
Quickly to your question, in terms of this juxtaposition that you sort of created between Modi's visit to Russia versus, the timing of the NATO summit, I think, on the one hand, I think these are scheduling issues. So I honestly don't think that there is too much optics behind it, at least from India's perspective. As Ambassador Saran pointed out, that this was a meeting which was long overdue and long awaited. And one of the reasons why it had not happened in the last 2 years was also because of the uncertainty, right, that had started to loom in every single sector that we were engaging with Russia. So I think the primary motive of Prime Minister Modi to go to Russia, I mean, finally, to go to Russia was to also address the imminent issues that had emerged because of the Ukraine war. And also, if you look at the key takeaways of the summit, I mean, he's still there, of course. Even if you look at the key takeaways, you'd notice that the biggest thing is that he has been successful, and he has been successful in attaining this promise from Russia, from President Putin, about return of all the Indian soldiers who have been recruited there. Okay, and that, if you remember, had become a big issue with the MEA, releasing that statement on June 11, etc. So that's one part, and the other thing was about trying to make sure that the rupee ruble mechanism works, because we all know that rupee ruble mechanism has not been able to work again because of certain structural issues, and India would not like to pay in yuan because that would be about tightening China's grip on de-dollarized trade. So what I'm trying to say is that I think from India's perspective, there were certain imminent issues that needed to be resolved and addressed at the highest level, because there were attempts made in the last 2 years, in the interregnum of the last 2 years, at different levels. I don't think they really worked out, because you saw that these issues also remained. We still have not heard about the deliveries of the remaining S-400 systems, by the way. I did not really, in fact, see that anywhere. So I'm hoping that this is still on schedule, which is the third quarter of 2026. But now, sort of juxtaposing it now with the NATO summit. Now, again, Snehesh, I think that itself has been scheduled for long. We've been knowing for the last 6 months that the NATO Washington summit, by the way, this is also the 75th anniversary of the NATO summit, happening in Washington on the 9th and 10th. So I basically, technically, it is not overlapping. It is like one after the other. So to be technically correct, we would be starting with the NATO summit when the Prime Minister actually lands in Austria. Okay, and because he also have this visit joined with the Moscow visit, the first one to Austria. So yes, NATO visit is happening, and out there. The biggest issue out there for the NATO countries is what happens in case somebody like the Donald Trump was to come back as American president. And I think one of the most important objectives out there is to try and Trump proof NATO as much as possible. There have been a lot of attempts happening. You know that it's not the same if America was to withdraw its support from NATO. And what would happen then to Ukraine and Ukraine assistance? By the way, also, I think I must share that I mean, contrary to what is generally understood, this particular summit is definitely not about Ukraine joining the NATO. Ukraine cannot
Yeah.
join NATO until the territorial integrity is, I mean, sort of decided. The question is decided. But what has happened in the interregnum, again, in the last, between the last summit and this one, is that you have all these. I mean, several, I think by now there are more than 10 and 10 to 12 European countries, as well as the US and Japan, who have concluded individual security agreements with Ukraine, which are all long term and 10-year, which will last 10 years, and they all focus on defense industry collaboration, etc. But in terms of the key takeaways in NATO, we still have to see that summit has to start, and we will see to what extent does that MAGA thing is going to haunt NATO. Yeah, back to you.
Well, I agree with you, Swasti, when you say that it shouldn't be seen. It should be seen separately, the NATO summit as well as Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Russia. Uh, but Ambassador, the Ukrainian President Zelensky doesn't seem to agree with either Swasti or me. He's after the pictures of Narendra Modi and President Putin's hug came out, he's gone on to X, formerly known as Twitter, and he's tweeted, and I'll read out his tweet. He says it is huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day. Now, how would you respond to this, and how do you see this? Viewers, you should remember that only last month, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi was there for the G7 meet where he hugged Zelensky as well. Ambassador.
Yeah, so a few, I mean, observations on this. Number one, obviously, look, the emotions are high. Clearly, these are the two immediate parties to the conflict. So one can understand if you had an India-Pakistan or India-China situation at war with each other. So I can understand the other party would feel aggrieved if a prime minister had visited Ukraine and not Russia. So I don't think there's a great surprise in the Ukrainian reaction. Number one. Number two, the Ukrainian approach and the Russian approach, I think India has this opportunity and its ability to contribute to de-escalation and limitation of the tensions in this conflict, because I think it's important that both sides understand that there is no solution to be found in escalating military conflicts and battles further. I think both the Ukrainians know it and the Russians know it. So, and the third thing is that, obviously both sides are taking absolutist positions. So the Ukrainians organized the so-called Swiss Peace Summit, where the Russians were kept out of it. The Indian view, which is very consistent with the Indian view of the last 2 years, is number one, the solution is in dialogue and diplomacy, and number two, in including Russia in any solution. That is inclusivity, dialogue, and diplomacy. If you do not ensure any of these, you're not going to have a solution. So I understand the Ukrainian reaction, but I would say that India's actions in the last 2 years, ever since the outbreak, has spoken for themselves. I mean, the way we have escalated and ratcheted up bilateral relations with every single major NATO power, even those we had neglected for decades, like the Baltics or the Nordics, is something which everyone knows. And lastly, I'm not sure whether the rest of the NATO and the European alliance would agree with the reaction coming from Zelensky. I mean, there is obviously, and it's quite evident, a lot of simmering tensions between Ukraine and the rest of Europe and between Ukraine and the Americans. And today, if you were to ask American strategic thinkers and observers, Ukraine has fallen off the radar out there. The new conflict, which is consuming the Americans right across the whole spectrum, is the Gaza conflict. Ukraine was right on the top in 22 and maybe 23. But as we approach the US election, and it's a matter of another 3, 4 months, everyone is waiting to see who's going to come into the White House.
So, you've mentioned that India does have a crucial role to play in peace. Now, Prime Minister Modi, in his interaction with Putin, and I'll read out his statement, he said, "I believe there is no peace on the battlefield and solutions to the war must be found through dialogue." Is there something that India can actually do? Because Prime Minister Modi, in his interaction with the Indian diaspora, said that when India talks peace, the world listens. Is there something really happening behind the scene? Do you think that India is capable of using friendship on both sides to ensure that peace develops?
I think so. I mean, if you were to do a kind of a run through the list of countries in the world and personalities who could perform this role, you would find very few people on your fingertips, because the first requirement to be a successful, if you can loosely use the word mediator, which I don't like, is that you must have credibility with both sides, and you must have the integrity which both sides hold you in. So if you look at Turkey, you look at China, you look at Israel, all of them have tried to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. And for various reasons, all of them have been unsuccessful. So the question is, who is left in the world? Is it South Africa? Is it Brazil? Is it Saudi Arabia? Who is this player or a group of players who can actually help? And it's very ironical where we are standing today. The developing world is actually trying to teach the rich and the powerful,
Yeah.
please talk to each other. This is something, this used to be the other way around. This traffic of trying to talk sense to the natives was the other way around. So here today it is this. So I think definitely the very act of his visit to Moscow, if we give him the benefit of doubt that he has not gone to Moscow to exacerbate tension, to add fuel to the fire, if we assume that is his intent, and as an Indian, I would completely, go with that assumption, then obviously the sheer fact of his visit is good, because here you have someone who's able to talk to Russia and talk to the Russian leadership and tell them as friends, listen, back off. What better can you expect? Unless your strategy is to ensure that the breakdown of communication is complete, it is never restored, and that you continue to escalate tensions from one level to another, and maybe to levels which we would not even like to dream of, unless that is the calculation. But I don't see how this vicious cycle of violence is going to end.
True. I hope that the vicious cycle actually ends soon. Uh, Swasti, while Prime Minister Narendra Modi was there, there was a series of attacks that took place inside Ukraine. And the reaction, the strong reaction from Zelensky is primarily because while Prime Minister Narendra Modi was there was a strike that took place. Now, the Russians say that it was actually not a Russian missile. It was actually an air defense system, an American air defense system, which was in use with the Ukrainians, which misfired. But do you think, was there any possible way where violence could have been avoided while Prime Minister Modi was there in that visit?
Well, Snehesh, I would have little to disagree because, considering, well, by the way, first, for the record, only Russia has said that it's not their missile, and I don't think there's anybody else that has said, and the number of
Of
attacks
course,
also shows.
everybody would say that it's the Russians because everybody is against Russia,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, everybody. So, and I mean, I'm not really getting there. I mean, even India has not really issued any statement on that whatsoever. But what I'm saying is that yes, if considering, saying that, imagining that, yes, it was really an attack which was done on, especially the children's hospital, and the pictures that really started flooding the internet after that. It kind of coincided almost perfectly with the time that Prime Minister Modi was landing in Moscow and all of that. So, see, on the one hand, it does put India in a very uncomfortable situation. Why? Because India, not everybody sort of understands also that the nuances behind India's approach between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, on the one hand, you have all the historic ties with Russia and all the bilateral issues and the national interests, etc. But even when it comes to Ukraine, I think India has been trying to have a very nuanced approach. So it's not just the Swiss summit that India went and did not sign the joint communique. The Swiss summit was actually a series, the fourth in the series of international peace summits that started from Denmark in Copenhagen. So from Denmark in Copenhagen to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia to Malta and then to Switzerland, India has had consistent participation in all of these. In fact, if you ask me to rate them, I would say that the one that happened in Saudi Arabia was perhaps one of the most successful one, which had also most turnout of the global south. And by the way, it did not have, and Russia has been consistently uninvited in all of those. So it's not
Yeah,
really only specific to the Switzerland summit. But what I
yeah.
want to convey is that the one in Jeddah was actually attended by NSA, Ajit Doval. And the point is that we have done that on the one hand. We did not sign on the joint communique, also because of the technical factor that if you read the joint communique, it derives from two of United Nations General Assembly resolutions where we had abstained. So technically speaking, it doesn't make sense for India to join on the to sign on the joint communique when we have abstained on the
On the main
UN
vote in the
resolution.
UN.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the bigger factor is that India is also steadfast when it comes to negotiation and diplomacy and having both sides on the table. So that's, of course, that's there. But the point is that we have also been sending more than 15, 16 tranches of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So the image that India has been trying to project, which is a very credible and which is a very, I would say, which has come through a lot of hard work. If you remember all the G20 diplomacy, and if you remember
Yeah.
all these 2 years and the kind of balancing that we have done, it obviously strikes a very discordant note to somewhere register that as the Prime Minister was there, and somebody, a Prime Minister that has always called that this is not an era of war and there will only be solution through diplomacy and dialogue, has to actually have that as a backdrop. So
So,
I would, yeah.
some would recall an incident what happened in 1971 when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the former prime minister, was then a foreign minister, and he had visited China, and that's when China, during his visit, is when the China launched an attack on Vietnam, and at that time the foreign minister Vajpayee actually curtailed this trip as a protest. Is there any kind of link between? Do you see it as a link between similar situations, Swasti?
Well, I honestly don't think so because, like I said, that India has always tried to distance itself from bloodshed and violence of all sorts, and we have maintained. If you look at going by what has happened in the last 2 years, I think the best thing is for India to sort of only distance itself, and absolutely, which is the right thing also to do because it has come at the wrong geopolitical timing. The geopolitical timing has been wrong, but I would rather wait for the Indian establishment to come out with a statement on it than to just assume things based on my own
Perfect.
sort of preferences. But yes, it is an uncomfortable geopolitical moment. Yes, there's no doubt about that.
Well, I'll agree to that. That it's quite uncomfortable geopolitical situation there. Ambassador, now Prime Minister Modi has undertaken this visit. It comes at a time when there is tensions across the world. The US is trying to align more with us. The US has issued a statement regarding this particular visit. How do you see India balancing this Indo-Russia as well as the Indo-US ties. Now, Prime Minister Modi has also announced opening up of two new consulates in Russia. So this is like really deepening our relationship. We're not going by what the West is telling us.
Yeah, so isn't that a good thing? I mean, you pursue your interests. I mean, if you want to go to
Absolutely.
look at your,
Yeah.
if you want to look at your relations with Russia through the eyes of Washington, then you are in for disaster. The fact of the matter is, you have a relationship with Washington, you have a relationship with Moscow, and you pursue them on independent tracks. We don't believe in this alliance system of us versus them. Otherwise, what's the difference between today and the Cold War? We do not believe in this zero sum, black and white world order. We do not. As
Absolutely.
India, we've never had, it's not anything to do with the current government, it's Indian strategic culture. It's been a consistent element of Indian foreign policy. And by the way, on this analogy of 79, it is completely flawed. The fundamental flaw is China was an enemy country. Vajpayee had gone to make peace with an enemy. Modi has not gone to make peace with an enemy in Moscow. So please, we have to maintain the separation between Russia and China. We have to be clear in our minds as Indians who's your primary strategic challenge and who's your friend. You cannot paint the two in the same brush. And
I agree with
this
you.
business about innocent children and all. So what's happening to Gaza? I mean, who's there and how many TV shows are you holding on the kind of things which have been going on since October in Gaza? I mean, which Western media, which Western leader is telling us about the atrocities that are going on? So I think we live in an unequal world. We live in a world in which morality leads you only to a certain point. This is power play. Everyone knows it. Washington knows it. Moscow knows it. Beijing knows it. It's time India also learnt it.
That's a very strong statement that you've made, and I completely agree with you on that. So before I let you both go, one last question to you, sir. China is also becoming a factor in this whole equation, right? India-Russia equation. You have Russia, which is becoming closer to China. Is this something that should worry us? And if it worries us, how do we look at this, sir? And what are the
Yeah,
steps
so
that you take?
sure. So, I mean, obviously, here is a question, a state where you have a friend who has been pushed, in my opinion, by the Western policies towards China involuntarily. Now we have to watch, obviously, what are the shape and contours. Chinese scholars have told me there is no such thing as a no limits partnership. Even marriages have limits. So there is a lot of divergence of views within China on how they look at Russia. So I think we have to be very clear, not fall for the Western headlines. But we have to watch the relationship, obviously, in terms of military, in terms of security relationships, and see whether this relationship is having an impact on the India Russia relationship. That has to be based on empirical evidence, not subjectivity. Secondly, in terms of the response, so there are many ways to respond. I mean, we can have many episodes on this question. It's very complex. But the fact of the matter is that, to put it simply, one is we drop Russia, or we assume that Russia is in the Chinese so-called camp, and we treat Russia like not a friend but a neutral or an adversary, in which case your whole geostrategic scenario in Eurasia changes. The other is that you have a more sophisticated analysis of Russia, what drives the Russia China relationship, give Russia the options that it wants in Asia, because Russia is not comfortable with dealing only with China or outsourcing its Russia Asian policy to China, and to provide Russia that option, number one. And number two, to convey to Russia that, look, our relationship is very important for us. So it's a gentle reminder about how you deal with China. Keep our interests in mind. So there are many dimensions, but I think the choice that we have taken of engaging with Russia, yeah, and continuing the relationship. Basically, this visit is nothing else except the continuation of the relationship. I have argued that it would be headlines if Modi had gone to China. That would be headlines. But what is the headline if he's going to Moscow?
Very true. Thank you, both of you, for speaking to the print. One thing is very clear that how I see this visit is I would see this as a very brave step by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Comes at a time when the West is all, trying to close in on us. The fact, as Ambassador said, India will not look at his interests through the prism of of Washington. But thank you so much, both of you, for speaking to the print. Pleasure.